Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this evening at Cambridge University Library. My name's Suzanne Paul. I'm the keeper of rare books and early manuscripts in the library, and I'm delighted to see we have a full house and extra chairs having to be added at the back, not surprisingly, in honour of our speaker. So this is the first of a series of Fellows talks by the Munby Fellows in Bibliography at the University Library for 2024-25. So tonight's lecture is by Dr. Harry Spillane. Harry completed his PhD in history in 2022, supervised by Professor Alex Walsham. He is no stranger to the library, obviously. In 2021, he was the winner of the library's Gordon Duff Prize for an essay in bibliography. He has completed numerous articles on early modern Bibles, and his monograph on the Bishop's Bible is forthcoming from CUP very soon. Also forthcoming is a monograph on the printing of the Bible to coincide with the 500th anniversary of the publication of the Tyndale Bible, coming out next year in collaboration with an exhibition in a library in another place that we do not mention. But we are very lucky this year to have had Harry as a Munby Fellow at Cambridge University Library, where he has been investigating a collection of material in the Bible Society Library. And this is the fruits of this research in the library. And his talk this evening is A Maker of Chocolates and Bibles, Francis Fry's Collecting, Correcting and Cataloguing. Harry.
Thank you. Well, I want to begin by giving you a sense of what it means to go through Fry's Bibles, which gives me an opportunity to say thank you to the library here. I should say that where we are, the Bible Society Library is housed on the very far side of the library that way, and the room in which I can view them is the far side of the library that way. And librarians have very kindly, day by day, carried Bibles that often weigh more than 10 kilograms back and forwards, and each slip of paper here represents a Bible they have, without complaint, carried back and forward. I fear it means I shall not be much missed when July comes, but the librarians will have to take up weightlifting if they are to continue the muscles I've helped them build. So, Francis Fry, then. Francis Fry is a name that has loomed over my research on the history of English Bibles for many years. It was as a master's student looking for doctoral research, a doctoral research project, that I came across the Bishop's Bible, the version of the Bible before King James, which very little had been written on. And so the first thing I did was to see as many copies as I could. And there, within almost all Cambridge copies, was this name, Francis Fry. And looking back on the notes I took then, I had put Francis Fry, ? Who is he? And today I want to answer that question for all of you. Francis Fry might be known to some of you as a great collector of Bibles, but he is possibly more likely known as the maker of chocolate. But today we want to think about three questions. What did Francis Fry collect? Now the answer, you say, might be Bibles, but it's a little more complicated than that. What did he do with his collection? And how did he collect? So let's start with collections and by thinking about Francis Fry, the very Victorian-looking gentleman on the end. Francis Fry is born in 1803, dies in 1886, and his collection is essentially broken up but sold to the Bible Society from 1890 onwards. He's a businessman of Fry's Chocolate Factory, but also a bibliographer. And today it's the relationship between these two parts of his life that I want to think about. How does being a great Victorian businessman equip you to be a great Victorian bibliographer, and perhaps vice versa? He's a Quaker. This is worth noting not simply because it's something that Fry writes about and talks about a lot, but because it does direct the way in which he collects, and in particular, as I'll suggest, the way in which he forms relationships with other collectors, museums, cataloguers, archivists and librarians. So he's based in Bristol, where J.S Fry Sons is producing, but his network extends far beyond that. I say that I want to think about the relationship between Fry as businessman and bibliographer, and it's worth saying, therefore, that Fry comes from a long and distinguished line of businessmen, entrepreneurial family, the Fry family are. And in particular, there are three connections that Fry has that means that when he starts collecting Bibles, producing books of his own, he has lots of knowledge within his family connections to fall back on. So the Fry family, before they had been producing chocolate, had been producing type. And we see two examples of their type here. The Fry family also have a number of printing assets, one of which is overseen eventually by Fry's son, who forms an alliance with the Barclay family of Barclay's Bank fame, and produce essentially the promotional material for the chocolate factory, but also have a very large supply of historic press material, which gives Fry a very useful connection, which we will think about later. Fry is based in Bristol then, and this gives him a number of relevant connections, and might in fact explain, as his son later suggests, why his fascination with the Bible develops. For Francis Fry repeatedly tells people that the greatest Englishman of all time is William Tyndale, rather than William Shakespeare. And he says that it's William Tyndale who gives the English their language when, in 1525-26, he translates the New Testament into English. And it is in Bristol that there is the only known complete copy at the time of Tyndale's first New Testament. It's housed quite sort of unobtrusively in the Baptist College in Bristol, and we know that Fry has had connections with them before he starts collecting Bibles. It is Tyndale it's Tyndale's story that leads to Fry travelling around Germany to try and trace the origin of Tyndale's texts. It's Fry who very early on starts to suggest ways in which Tyndale's texts were printed. And I think it's not a surprise, therefore, that someone who grows up in Bristol, who lives, as it turns out, just a few hundred metres away from this college for a while, is interested in this English Bible history. So Fry is also well connected with the Bible Society in his lifetime, the Bible Society which is now as a library housed here, but is at the time at Bible House in London. And there are numerous letters that show the way in which Fry is using that collection, but also how he is shaping it. And that's what I want to think about, for he's both a collector and, as the young might tell us, an influencer. As a schoolchild suggested to me, Francis Fry is the Willy Wonka of Bibles. I think that's rather nice. He accumulates nearly 1,300 Bibles, which is a truly enormous amount of historic 16th and 17th century Bibles. These Bibles extend into non-English translations too. When the collection is being sold after his death, it's purchased for the modern equivalent of about £500,000. To give you a sense of how the collection has increased in value, just a single copy of Tyndale's Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible in English, of which Fry has 2 copies, sold for $600,000 in 2016. So, Fry is someone who's aware of the kind of value of his collection, and it has certainly continued to grow over time. As I say, when the Bible Society moved from their London residence to Swindon, various decisions mean that the library ends up moving here. There are 2 comments that I will give now. The first is from the valuer, who at the time was keeper of rare books at the British Museum, George Bullen, who says it's a collection the likes of which has not ever been formed and cannot likely be formed again. And as I'll suggest later, that is what is so important about this collection. In a way, it's the cannot be formed again bit. If you were all very generously to give me every penny you had, I could not accumulate that collection because of the rarity of the editions he has. It would be almost impossible to assemble a similar collection. And yet, as Macmullen notes, it's a collection that has muddied the water for future scholars because of what Fry has done with it. So we're left with a double problem. This collection, the likes of which has not been formed, but a collection we can't form again, and therefore what Fry has done to it is an incredibly important question to try and understand. To give a sense of the scale of the collection beyond the university library, for that is what I've spent the past few weeks thinking about, is, well, how do Fry's tentacles extend beyond his own library? Early English Books Online is a database familiar to many early modern historians, or historians of the book. It provides provides PDFs essentially of early modern books printed in the early modern period. And of English Bibles that are contained on there, 6 of them have notes from Fry in, but these are not copies from Cambridge, they're copies that have ended up elsewhere. In the Bodleian, for example, nearly a third of English Bibles there show signs of having passed through Francis Fry's hands, even more at the British Library. And to think about the continued relevance of Fry in terms of modern-day collecting, this edition of a text that we have a copy of here, this is a presentation volume. Your eyes are not deceiving you, $50,000 it's up for. My birthday is in January. Not an awful lot has been written about Francis Fry, and that's what attracted me to think more about it. But what has been written about Francis Fry is a very good, I suppose, introductory chapter by the late David Hall, whose wise words I've often wished I could have fallen back on in the past year. And David shows by using Fry's published material that, as he says, his confidence in the area of bibliography exceeded the real state of knowledge at the time. And that is, I think, a useful metric to think about Fry. He's someone who is living, as I'll suggest, in a period in which bibliography is changing, and he's sort of caught up in that. As Edward Arber suggests in a letter to Fry, he says, well, you should rest from all your labours now because your works will remain for all time. And that's equally problematic because even now, as I'm finding when going about a current project where we're investigating 2 very lovely copies of the Great Bible, in order to begin understanding them, we still have to go back to Fry, whether we like it or not. David Hall then relied on published material, in particular letters that had been collected by his son. However, each and every book in the Fry collection has something in it. Many of them more than this, but then it's quite hard to photograph. So this is a small book, we have it here for you to see after, and there are 12 items within it that each show us something about what Fry is doing or has done or has been done to his book after his death. So we have here, for instance, letters to binders, letters to the buyer from who it's from, letters talking about this book that he has written to others. Fry is very unusual in that he often asks for people to send his letters back to him. This is something I'm trying to unpick a bit further. I mean, perhaps that's a sign of privacy, I don't know. Fry's books have very nice surprises in them. We have on display here, for example, the only survival that we have of a small printed sheet that would originally have hung from copies of the Great Bible displayed in St Paul's Cathedral in the 1540s, telling people how to read or how not to read the Bible, in particular not to read it out loud. Now, if Fry hadn't have pasted this in and tried to match it up, we would have lost what is essentially a very good piece of evidence for the early history of Bible reading. So Fry is someone who is doing more than just buying books and putting them into a library. Indeed, what he's often doing, as he says, is correcting them. And this is an extremely ominous phrase. What does it mean to correct the Bible? Fry is not alone in having tried to correct copies of Bibles he gets. And I show you this for 2 reasons. Firstly, that I don't regard it as my job to make a hero of Fry, but I certainly don't regard it as my job to make a villain of him. But I'm aware that, speaking to a room where I can see a number of rare book specialists, that someone who takes a scalpel to books is unlikely to be popular. But I'd like to suggest he's not unusual for what he does. We have 3 examples here of title page adaptations. So what we have is someone has bought a book without a title. They bought an early modern Bible, but it has no title page. page, which is a shame because they're often pretty. So they've managed to find the title page that should be there. The problem is the title page is from a later edition or an earlier edition. So the central panel, where the date is, would then be incorrect. So what they've done is take a scalpel, cut away the incorrect information, I say incorrect information, and then pen and inked it in as best they can. And these are three quite good examples. This one rather less so. The Denyer collection, on the whole, is not terribly well done. Henry VIII was not a terribly patient man, and I suspect not terribly pleased with this, neither Thomas Cromwell's rather elongated face or Cranmer's pained expression. So Fry then is able to benefit from technological change. That's partly what distinguishes Fry. For as Fry is collecting either new or developing technologies for reproduction, printing are occurring, or improvements to them, the chief of which lithographic printing or photographic reproduction. So we have a tracing that Fry has made here for a title page that he was supplying at a cost for someone else, and this tracing is essentially copied onto a stone, and the kind of combination of oil and ink and water not mixing allows for reproduction. And it allows for much better reproduction than this. It allows for reproduction so convincing that it is very difficult at times to tell an original from a facsimile of Fry's. All the more so because he goes to the special effort of commissioning replica paper. He pays attention to watermarks and chain marks, to texture and colour. So one has to be very cautious with Fry. Fry benefits, though, from having a web of contacts that extends well beyond Bristol and chocolate. Fry, and this is why I think thinking about him as both a businessman and bibliographer is so helpful, that the skills of the businessman, the introductory letters, the exchange, the trade, is sort of creeping into his bibliography in a way that I don't think is true of many others. So, for instance, John Harris Jr., one of the great facsimile makers, becomes indebted to Fry in all sorts of ways. This is a piece that he has done. On the right is pen and ink. On the left is early modern print. They're almost impossible to tell apart. The royal binder, Charles Tuckett, is frequently being asked to do things by Fry, and towards the end of his career, asking Fry for advice. It's when the balance starts to flip, as we shall see. And George Offer, the great bookseller, is essentially, it seems, on a kind of retainer from Fry to buy Bibles. And then on the other side, the great collectors, who in many ways have rather more wealth than Fry, and yet Fry always manages to buy before them. We'll think about why later. The great American collector, James Lennox, who is something of Fry's rival, they come to a kind of agreement that they will share facsimiles with each other. Henry Stevens is frequently supplying Fry with information. Lord Ashburnham, the fourth Earl, fourth Earl Ashburnham, after a while essentially lets Fry use his collection as a kind of borrowing library. So this is a remarkable kind of set of connections. But a question which had sort of remained unanswered, well actually, how does Fry do this? Where does he get his facsimiles from? How does he produce them? And again, it's the chance find of Fry, ever the kind of Quaker industrial businessman making use of scrap paper at every possible end. So he writes notes about one of his Bibles on the back of a receipt from a facsimile maker. So now we have a nice connection to actually trace and think about how he's doing these things. And he tells us, in this letter, the facsimile writer writes to him and says, look, I'm having a bit of trouble, I can't open this damn Bible wide enough. And it turns out that he's stretching this Bible out, but this Bible has been taken out of the British Museum by Fry. And it stays with this facsimile maker for nearly 4 months. It is in the 1860s that the British Museum Library are trying to increase their collection of English Bibles. They're aware that they don't have a collection that is sort of suitable for an institution of their renown. And Fry benefits from this because he essentially says, well, I will offer you all of the connections you need, but essentially in return, I will get something from it, which is access to the Bibles I need. And all of this allows Fry to produce one of his first major facsimile works, which we have for you to see after. Fry's fascination with Tyndale continues throughout his life, and he decides that it's a great shame that many people can't see a copy of Tyndale's New Testament in Bristol, so he'll make a facsimile of it. And he spends many years poring over tracings and producing a very, very accurate facsimile. And this facsimile is sent far and wide. This is one of the editions of Fry that, even though there is a cost price, it's clear, as I've worked out, that almost all of them are given away by him. This is, I suppose, a way of getting his name out there in this early period of his work. We can see some of his preparatory work. We've seen the tracing paper. We have here the sort of notes he's taking of watermarks. We have his notebooks for you to see afterwards. All in all, Fry clearly spends about 2 years on this work, and we are lucky enough to have draft sheets that come back to him that he corrects and sends back. He's constantly comparing them, and even the smallest error is sent back to be fixed. So he's a man who cares quite deeply about accuracy. And as a result, he makes a number of interesting observations and finds. He spots, for instance, in Tyndale's later work, this difference of what are called the 3 stones. So at the start of the Epistle to St. Paul, we have the blank stone edition, because it's a blank stone, the Maker's Mark edition, where there is a Maker's Mark, and the lovely named Mole edition, because there's some kind of furry animal in its place. And what's interesting is that Fry notes this. It's quite important. But what Fry doesn't have is, I suppose, a practical knowledge of printing. And this is what limits so much of Fry's work, that he thinks about early modern printing in a very Victorian businessman fashion, with all the kind of logic and efficiency he has for his factory. And he surmises, therefore, that early modern printers print from Genesis through to Revelation, and that's logical in what they do. And that the same printer sees the job through. And he doesn't really work out that's very unlikely to have happened, that printing is split up, that something that's called one edition exists in many different forms, that printers will subcontract, and so on and so forth. So what Fry's often doing is noting things that are very interesting and leaving it there. So it falls to that next generation on the whole to pick many of these things up. And Fry then starts to generate considerable interest for the work he's doing, and as a result the opportunities for investigation continue to multiply, and now he goes from being Bristol-based and London-based to international, and the libraries of Zurich are opened up to him. In this case he decides not to travel, but to pay artists to go out and trace things for him. And we have correspondence to show how this all worked. And the result is that Fry now has working, certainly in the mid-1860s, he has about 3 artists, tracers, engravers who work for him on contract and who can travel to libraries that he can't. So he explains here that he sends someone over to Zurich, he has them traced, and then he has these things reproduced, and again with paper prepared from the original. So we see that Fry is instructing the tracer not just to take note of the text, but of the materiality of these things. So comments come back about the paper, the watermarks, the chain lines, and so on. So it's in the 18th, and I'm afraid there's not a terribly large amount of chocolate in this talk, which is why there's a chocolate bar for you afterwards. This is about 98% Bibles, 2% chocolate. But there are interesting connections with chocolate, again, helpfully left to us by Fry by chance, which is that he scribbles notes about a Bible from 1550 on the back of a note sent to shareholders explaining how the business is doing. And it explains that Fry's is doing really rather well in 1860s. They're able to lower their prices, to raise dividends, they're able to lower the cost price of things, they're getting into international markets and so on. And it's at this time that Fry, it seems, is buying even more. And I think, again, one can see that someone who's doing rather well is spending rather more on their Bibles. And from there, the collection starts to grow and grow. it is at this point that Fry comes to attention for developing the first Easter egg in 1873, and it's in the 1860s that the cream bars, which kind of really take the market by storm, are being produced. So Fry essentially works out how to dip chocolate in things cheaply and how to shove things in chocolate cheaply, and does very well from it. And the result is that he embarks on a great project to collect great Bibles, which are costly. And he amasses an absolutely enormous collection of them. The starting point for his interest is that in the original Great Bible of 1539, Beardy Henry at the top, people at the bottom, that Thomas Cromwell has his coat of arms, but that in subsequent editions he does not. And the answer is that in between this and this, Cromwell has not just lost his coat of arms, but his head, and it's therefore inappropriate to depict a traitor on the title page to an English Bible. But again, printers, and this is where Fry sort of doesn't think so practically, printers don't want to pay for a whole new title page, so they cut that bit out and say, well, now that's just Joe Bloggs, don't worry about it. And this kind of seems to pique Fry's interest. And from there, he's interested in the development of the Great Bible throughout the 7 first folio editions from 1539 to 1541. And the result is that he starts to gather copies together. And we can follow his progress through letters. By 1863, he's compared 80 copies, and by 1864, 145. And it's in 1863 that he starts putting plans in place for his enormous description of the Great Bible, which you can see afterwards at the front. So we know more about this project, in fact, from Fry's son, but Fry does tell us at the start that he's confident there is no perfect and correct copy of the first 4 editions of the Great Bible, Cranmer's Bible, but mine. And I have by much labour compared copies, discovered various editions which no one else has noticed, and this adds much to their value. That is true, he does indeed. But then more problematically, I have cut mixed books up. But he tells us he's always been positive to use the same edition always. The positive in the always is just a bit much, isn't it? And one wants to test that a bit. Is it true? And he says very confidently twice, in fact, in the work, this has enabled me to prove what is the true edition. And so I spent a lot of time trying to think, well, what does Fry mean by correct, perfect and true? Because these are words he throws around rather a lot. So we're told then that he's eventually examined 146 copies, this is by his son, and that only 31 were found correct. So that's correct by Fry's metric, and that 115 were wrong. Okay. And we're told that at one time about 40 of them lay open in the Fry's great dining room at Tower House in Cotham, Bristol. So this is something which young Theodore remembers being a part of. So we've got 31 Bibles Fry deems to be true, and 115 he deems not, that he then cuts up and changes to some extent. Now, Fry is helpful in that at the start of most of his books he tells us what he did, so that's helpful. The problem is that over time these letters, particularly in the Bible Society, have often come out and been swapped around. So there have been a number of cases where a bit of detective work has had to be done to reunite letters back to where they should have been. But what is clear is that what Fry deems to be incorrect copies are copies which have these mixed leaves in, and they have mixed leaves in because that is precisely how they were printed at the time, or so to speak, bound. This is partly because of the awkward production history of the Great Bible shifting from Paris to London as a result of interruption at the hands of the French authorities. It's partly a result of the division of labour that seems to have existed between its two printers. And these are things that Fry can't factor in. So instead, he's trying to perfect something which was, in fact, from the beginning, not perfect. So he produces this very large text, you can see after, and then, like a good businessman, he thinks, well, then there's got to be a gimmick, and he therefore does something which a number of other collectors have done, but not to this extent, I would say, which is that at the end of every Fry book you bought were a set of original leaves from each of the Bibles mentioned. So if you buy a copy of this book, you get 14 16th and early 17th century pages as a gift. One might ask, well, where do these come from? Well, these we can see are the cut up and mixed copies he thinks shouldn't be there. I've only had a chance to start work on it, but what is clear is that the leaves Fry takes out and starts shoving at the back of books are pretty much those that seem to have been the ones that don't fit his metric of what is perfect, but as I've said, that is a flawed metric. It is, however, an absolutely stunning book, and as I say, I'm not trying to heroise or villainise him. It's a true labour of love. Each of these represents tracings which have gone through various iterations. We have his notebooks here. You'll be able to see both the original of this and Fry's tracing for it. And I mean, it is a true labour of love and an astonishing achievement, but its legacy is rather more problematic. He produces this absolutely bonkers chart, which folds out from this book. It's an attempt to try and get you to identify which edition you have in front of you. So I thought, well, the only way to see if it works is to try it. So with a copy of this, I've gone round some Cambridge libraries and tried to find books that Fry couldn't possibly have seen, because they were in private collections and have entered libraries after. And to his credit, you can, in fact, identify which copy is which. And, as it turns out, 3 copies in Cambridge libraries, colleges not to be named, were incorrectly catalogued. So Fry can be used to a helpful bibliographic end. But now I want to reflect on this relationship between his expertise and his enormous kind of wealth, legacy, and communication network. Fry has a business card, which is this very lovely list of works he's published. And I don't know how many copies he has, but he must have had hundreds of them printed, for any book that passes through his hands tends to have this pasted in. He clearly wanders around libraries with, kind of copies of this and the Victorian equivalent of a Pritt stick and just pastes them in, which is quite helpful because we can see where Fry has gone, and he normally signs the back corner. So we have a sense of where Fry has been. It's a kind of footprint that we can follow. And it's in the mid-1860s that Fry starts to come to kind of more popular attention. Again, a nice chance find. This is what I believe was originally a series of images that had been drawn and taken from Fry's shelves in his house in Bristol, published in a magazine. This is the work of Victor Prout. And someone has cut this out of the magazine and then rather sweetly tried to, because they tell us they've bought a Bible from Fry, and then they convince themselves that the Bible they bought is that one. Now, I mean, it tells us something about Fry's name becoming a household name, not just for chocolate, but for Bibles. And it's in this period that he gets the kind of scholarly pat on the head with his fellowship at the Society of Antiquaries. He's put forward for being an expert in the history of early English bibliography, especially the early editions of the Bible, and he has 2 formidable referees, the great Sir William Tite, who Fry has much correspondence with, who sends copies of his works to, one of which I've had digitised for you all to see up on Cambridge University Digital Library, and Bernard Bolingbroke Woodward, who is the Royal Librarian at Windsor. This connection helped me explain how Fry managed to borrow books from the Royal Collection, because on 3 occasions, books leave Windsor to head to London, and on 1 occasion at least it seems to Bristol. So this is a man who is in the middle of something, and who is, by 1866, seemingly coming to popular attention and scholarly attention as now a kind of unrivalled expert on the history of English Bibles. And this is true in the kind of London trade as well, for he starts to create connections which give him a near monopoly, or at least first dibs, on Bibles when they come to market. So there are a number of letters from booksellers that explain that as soon as a Bible comes into their hands, they'll basically send it on the train to Fry to look at, to verify, and if he wants to buy. And Fry in return says that any Bible he takes from them, he will sort of flat out pay 10 shillings more than they would otherwise have sold it for. So he has this monopoly of communication and is essentially using his wealth to say, I'll take it off your hands, it's a given. And chocolate again comes into the mix. There are a number of letters where he offers chocolate to sweeten the deal. In this case, the promise of a box of chocolate for Charles Hindley's 2 children. So at this point, it becomes obvious to booksellers that Bibles are passing through Fry's hands, and now he becomes a kind of broker of Bibles. So people write to him and say, I'd like to buy a Bible of 1541, what should I do? And Fry sort of says, when one comes into my hands, I'll send it to you. Or he becomes the broker for missing pages, which is much more problematic, because now what Fry's doing is subjecting his methods to many more books than those just in his collection. So now he's encouraging other people to cut things out of their Bibles, to send it to him, and in return he sends them what are the correct leaves and where to bind them. And in this case he's sending leaves back and forward between Lord Ashburnham and this anonymous gentleman of Kidderminster, who seems to have a rather large stash of broken Bibles. And that is when Fry's ears kind of prick up. Broken Bibles mean opportunities to do this kind of thing. And then, if you want, he'll make them up for you. So send your broken Bible to Fry, your incorrect Bible missing leaves, and he'll supply things, he'll supply and bind them, he'll value them, and give you a rather nice letter with which to paste in the front of your copy. In this case, he's supplying £2 for a number of facsimiles. He always says he does this at cost, and I believe him. This is a labour of love. It's clear he sinks his own money into things and is not profiting by it. And he values things. So Fry has a number of ledgers in which he keeps track of what he paid for things, what he thinks they're worth now, and whether other copies have come up recently at auction elsewhere. And so he's keeping a track of price. He's a great borrower of Bibles and an exchanger of Bibles. And sometimes he seems to ask permission. Other times he seems to follow the idea it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. So he frequently does things to people's Bibles, assuming they're all right with it, and they often seem to be. So in this case, someone sends a 1683 Bible to him, he takes what he wants from it, he puts other stuff back and says, free of charge. But the next step is that he becomes a kind of authenticator of Bibles, either directly or indirectly. For when Bibles pass through his hands, he scribbles in a pretty formulaic way his name for them, using a combination of words around true, perfect, correct, imperfect, what he thinks of them, where he's put facsimiles, and very often the number that he has given it in his own cataloguing system. Those Bibles then go back to their owner. What's then interesting, as I've been following up through sort of sales records and catalogues, is how that information is used over time. What starts to happen is Fry's opinion gets printed as fact. So here, for example, we have a number of these authenticity letters. You'll see again his calling card has been pasted behind. But now we have this information printed in catalogues as fact. Sometimes, as here, with his name, but very often not. So what is Fry's opinion based on his practices and methods becomes standard bibliographic knowledge, and it starts to be spoken about in that way. And we lose the Fry connection, so we lose that sense in which we might want to double-check it. This is all the more problematic because he's a great maker of catalogues and encourages people to refer back to him for things, be they private or kind of corporate sellers. We have a very nice copy of his catalogue, what seems to be his kind of final catalogue here in the Bible Society Library. And thinking again about the connections he draws on, this specially made catalogue, which has columns designed by Fry, is printed by Barclay and Fry, who we met earlier, alongside a number of other sort of unique notebooks that he's had made. Here then we have the April 1540 Bible we saw earlier, where Thomas Cromwell has lost his head and his coat of arms. And here it's logged quite simply as April 1540. Then when the collection comes into the hands of the Bible Society, they kind of have to work out what to do with this collection. And it's true that throughout Fry's life, while there is a lot of goodwill between Fry and the Bible Society, there is disagreement about what the purpose of collecting these Bibles should be. The Bible Society's raison d'etre is to produce cheap copies of the Bible or New Testament in vernacular languages and spread them across the globe. And to some extent they're interested in the history of the Bible and the bits that go around it, but they're mainly interested in textual authenticity. And they're rather less interested in having multiple editions of the same translation. And Fry says to them, well, this is nonsense. You must want multiple issues of the same translation. It's fundamentally important that you have a perfect record of the history of the English Bible. And the Bible Society don't want to invest in this. Fry thinks it's important, and he sort of circumnavigates the committee and starts appealing directly to the librarian to allow him to contribute things to the collection. So we have a slightly awkward thing where some of Fry's material enters the collection within his life, some of it afterwards, and this catalogue helps us make sense of that, for it's a catalogue in which Fry's system is being adapted to the Bible Society's cataloguing system at the time. So here again we see the same text, now given SS94. The problem is that Fry's way of doing things, though quite obvious here, is in fact rather odd, and it's partly because he wants to give everything a number in that very Victorian sense of order, but he runs out of numbers in the sense that he's given something 22 and 23, then he discovers there was an addition in between, but he doesn't like the idea of 23.5 or 22.5, and so things get messy. And it's a problem in that had Fry's collection have migrated into the society within his lifetime, I think we'd have a much clearer sense of what had happened to these books and how they'd been stored and changed, but we don't have that. I suspect that a question that's often asked is, well, why didn't Fry leave his collection to the Bible Society? Well, it might be because they were extremely valuable and he wanted them to stay in the family, but I think Fry was in fact suspicious of how the Bible Society would treat these texts. And seems to have gone to some effort to kind of teach them how to do things his way. Ultimately then, the Bible Society collection is then used to form one of the earliest complete printed catalogues of Bibles, initially by Darlow and Moule, edited by Herbert. So here again, we now have this kind of awkward thing where we have multiple numbers for each book. We have Fry's number, we have the revised number, we have William Tight's number, we have the Bible Society, Dr. Williams' number, and then we have the short title catalogue number. And sometimes this is accurate, but sometimes what's being referred to as one copy is in fact two different ones. But this printed catalogue remains a standard reference point. Although many are widely suspicious of it, it's again hard to avoid. And the legacy of this is that Fry's cataloguing system and information continues to penetrate what we're doing today. So what I've suggested is that Fry is a businessman and a bibliographer, but that we do well not to see those as separate parts of his life. They're very much blurring. The skills and practices of one side of his life are blurring with another, the people, the connections, the assets, the time. He's someone who could not have done what he was doing 20 years before, and who also could not have done it 20 years later. He couldn't have done it 20 years before because of technological reasons, and he couldn't have done it 20 years later because the Bibles would have gone if someone else had bought them. He's someone who combines scholarly connections with scholarly access. He's someone who combines a reliable reputation with booksellers, with the cash to buy things. And it's clear that booksellers think nothing of sending a whole box of books down to Fry, and that he will pay what's due. He'll send them back. It's happening. Certainly, in terms of Henry Stevens, sometimes these kinds of monthly deliveries of Bibles. And he's someone whose business life is booming around the time he's producing these works which he's heavily subsidising. I found very little evidence that people bought these books, and much more evidence that, again, they're being sent by him to important people. This is especially true of his early works, which he sends to prestigious libraries and collectors, very much in order to give himself a name, to give himself entry to their collections, proof of his scholarly skill and interest. it falls to Theodore Fry to write the one kind of, I suppose, cogent, flowing narrative of Fry's life. Theodore is Fry's son, becomes an MP amongst other things, and he puts together this memoir of Fry, in which, quite rightly, he calls attention to the role of Fry's wife, Matilda, who is kind of written out perhaps of this collection. But it's interesting that many letters that talk just about Bible stuff are addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Fry, that we know that Matilda accompanies him on various trips, and I think what I'm trying to do over the next few weeks is to see whether we can put her back into the picture a bit. I'm aware this has been a very beardy Victorian man-heavy set of slides, but alas, there is very little of her left. But we are told by Theodore that it's a family endeavour. You know, we've been told about these 40 Bibles lined up, and it's clear that Fry's relying on people to help him out. And yet, Theodore recalls that his general library was really very small, that he was not a book buyer as many are. He bought with an object, and that object was to secure as complete as possible a series of English Bibles, New Testaments and Psalters. And Theodore continues to say that at first it was only in leisure hours, but as years rolled by, it became almost a life work. It's a life's work I have very much enjoyed exploring over the past few months and look forward to finishing in the coming, and I hope that you've been able to get a sense of the sheer scale of what Fry was up to, the enthusiasm, the skill, the resources put into it, but perhaps also the problematic legacy it has left. Thank you all very much.